final term and the very important term that we'll have to understand is binding. Every function will have a binding. Similar to a trigger, a function will have an input binding and output binding. Consider a scenario wherein you have a trigger which is based on a blob storage, meaning whenever a new file is added to a blob, your Azure function is triggered. Now, whenever an Azure function is triggered, uh, you will have to get the details of the recently added file so that you could process and Azure function can process the same. So whenever a trigger is triggered, one way is for you to connect your blob and figure out which is the recent file uploaded, which means you will have to connect to the Azure Blob Storage and write additional logic you which which is required for you to understand the file details and the additional details. Alternatively, functions provide the binding wherein you can define the input binding to as an blob input, which means whenever a file is added as part of the trigger and the function gets the input of all the details of the blob as an input binding, so that you need not connect back to the storage to understand the file details but start processing based on the input binding. Similarly, output binding is wherein, let's say, you want to, wherein as part of the Azure function, you take the message from a blob and send out an email. So an email is, you connect to a third-party system to send an email through SMTP or various other details. So output binding defines what I received the input, I have processed, and where is it that I have to send. So the output binding can again be a blob, a queue, a service bus, or any other output binding which will allow you to send the information to a third-party system or any other output types.